America's #1 corned beef.
Dad, I made some fun.
He's gonna be what's in the bag! Chewy, yummy, smoky bacon!
Heckla, if you ate like this today, you'd need a lawyer or a doctor. In the 1940s, people cooked with banned ingredients, served meals that could turn deadly, and trusted products we now outlaw. So what was on the menu, and how did it ever seem normal? During World War II, with grocery store shelves often bare and meat heavily rationed, Americans were encouraged to become more self-sufficient. That is where Victory Gardens came in. Backyards, schoolyards, and even city rooftops transformed into miniature farms. Along with vegetables, many families raised rabbits for meat. They were small, quiet, easy to feed, and reproduced quickly, making them an ideal source of protein when times were tight. But raising rabbits was only part of the story. Many people began selling them at roadside stands, freshly butchered, often still warm and entirely unregulated. Neighbors and passers-by would pull over, hand over a few coins, and take home dinner. There were no labels, no expiration dates, and definitely no inspections. It was normal, even encouraged, during the war. Fast forward to today, and that same practice would land you in legal trouble. United States Department of Agriculture regulations now require strict oversight for meat sales. Selling backyard rabbit meat might have fed a nation once, but today it would bring the government to your door. Not too long ago, if you wanted liver, kidneys, or even brains, you did not go to a supermarket. You went to your neighborhood butcher. These local shops were community staples, often passed down for generations, and they sold cuts you almost never see anymore. Organ meats, also known as offal, were cheap, nutrient-dense, and widely eaten by working-class families who could not afford premium cuts of beef or pork. And here is the thing. Much of it was sold without any federal inspection. That was not a concern at the time. People trusted their butcher, and the idea of a government official overseeing every part of a cow or pig was simply not reality. These organs were used in everything from stews and sausages to fried sandwiches and casseroles. Today, selling organ meats without proper federal inspection is a serious violation. That includes livers, kidneys, and definitely brains, which are now extremely rare due to concerns about diseases like bovine spongiform encephalopathy. You can still find organ meats, but good luck getting them from someone who knows your name and how you like them sliced. Before there were warnings on labels and public health campaigns, there was homemade ice cream. Every Sunday, especially in summer, families would gather on porches or in backyards to hand-crank their own frozen desserts. Recipes were simple: cream, sugar, maybe some vanilla, and almost always raw eggs. That is right. Raw eggs were a standard ingredient in homemade ice cream. They helped create a smooth, rich texture and were considered perfectly safe. No one thought twice about cracking open a few eggs, mixing them into the base, and passing it around to the kids. It was just how it was done. But things have changed. Today, using raw eggs in homemade recipes is considered a major health risk. The Centers for Disease Control and the United States Department of Agriculture warn against eating anything that includes raw or undercooked eggs due to the risk of salmonella. That risk is real, but back then, it simply was not on most people's radar. Now, if you want that same texture in your homemade ice cream, you need to buy pasteurized eggs or cook the base to a safe temperature before freezing it. The carefree days of tossing ingredients in a bowl and cranking away are mostly gone. It is a reminder of how much food safety has evolved. Something as innocent as a scoop of vanilla could now be considered dangerous. What was once a symbol of home and tradition is now a textbook case in foodborne illness prevention. There was a time, and not that long ago, when horse meat was just another item at the grocery store, especially during times of economic hardship like the Great Depression and both world wars. Horse meat was seen as a practical alternative to beef. It was cheaper, leaner, and in some places even preferred. Entire butcher shops were dedicated to it. Ads ran in local papers. Recipes were published in cookbooks. And yes, people knew it was a horse. It was not a secret. It was just food. What changed? In the United States, cultural attitudes toward horses began to shift. No longer viewed as just working animals, horses became companions. pets even. The idea of eating a horse started to feel wrong, taboo, even unethical. By the 1970s, most Americans had turned away from the idea altogether. Federal laws began to tighten. Today, selling horse meat for human consumption is banned in many states. Even where it is not outright illegal, slaughtering horses for food faces strict restrictions, and facilities that process horse meat for people are nearly non-existent. Yet in other parts of the world, horse meat is still eaten and even celebrated. But here in the United States, it is not just off the table, it is off limits. You know what else is off limits now? Bear meat. Believe it or not, bear meat used to be a regular item on the menu, especially at hunting clubs and game dinners. It was not uncommon for hunters to bring back a bear from the woods, butcher it on site, and serve it right there in a stew pot or smoked over an open flame. It was rugged, resourceful, and for some, a badge of honor. Bear meat was often described as rich, dark, and slightly sweet. It was a true delicacy in the hunting world. Local clubs would even host annual events where wild game, including deer, rabbit, turkey, and yes, bear, was the main attraction. These gatherings were social, traditional, and deeply tied to local food culture. Today, things are very different. Selling bear meat commercially is nearly impossible due to strict state and federal regulations. Hunting laws are tighter. Processing requirements are more demanding. And because bears are considered both a game species and a potential public health risk, the rules around handling and selling their meat are incredibly complex. Even if you legally hunt a bear, you cannot just walk into a store and sell the meat. It has to be for personal use or shared informally. In many states, selling it at all is completely banned. What was once a symbol of self-reliance and community pride is now a legal and logistical nightmare. The bear might still roam the woods, but on the dinner table, it is nearly extinct. Back in the day, if you wanted bacon, you did not head to the store. You made it yourself, right in your own bathtub. Yes, really. Families would buy pork belly from the local butcher and cure it at home using saltpeter, a chemical compound also known as potassium nitrate. It preserved the meat, gave bacon that signature pink color, and added a distinct flavor people swore by. The process was simple, but far from safe. You rubbed the saltpeter into the pork, packed it with salt and sugar, and let it sit in a cool spot, sometimes literally in the bathtub, for days or weeks. No refrigeration, no inspection, just trust in family tradition. Today, that same process is considered hazardous. Potassium nitrate is now heavily regulated, and using it improperly can cause serious health risks, including nitrate poisoning. The United States Department of Agriculture requires strict guidelines for meat curing, including approved curing agents and precise measurements. What was once a mark of self-sufficiency is now a red flag for food safety inspectors. Homemade bacon still exists, but now it requires controlled environments, food-safe ingredients, and a lot of paperwork if you want to sell it. The image of someone casually making bacon in their bathtub sounds almost charming, until you realize the health risks. But back then, it was just another way to stretch the grocery budget and keep meat on the table. There was a time when local churches and community fundraisers were known for more than just bake sales. They were hubs for home canned goods, pickled eggs, canned meats, fruit preserves, jams, and even stewed tomatoes, all sealed in mason jars and labeled by hand. You bought them to support your neighbor, not because they were certified by a lab. Canning was an art, passed down through generations. Volunteers would gather in church kitchens or home basements to prep massive batches, pour them into jars, and sell them at events to raise money for local causes. It was all done with care, but not always with science. Today, that same act of goodwill would violate modern food safety laws. Selling home-canned, low-acid foods like meats, eggs, or vegetables is prohibited without proper inspection and certification. That is because the risk of botulism, a rare but serious illness caused by improperly canned food, is too high. Now, if you want to legally sell canned goods, you need a certified kitchen, approved recipes, pH testing, and in many states, a food handler's license. Homemade pickled eggs might still show up at the odd community event, but officially, they are off the menu. This shift from trust-based community exchange to regulated safety reflects how far we have come and how much we have lost. What was once a symbol of grassroots generosity is now something you might get fined for. If you went to a county fair in the early to mid-20th century, you would not just find cotton candy and funnel cake. In some parts of the country, you would also find squirrel stew, a warm, hearty dish made with freshly hunted game. It was especially popular in rural areas where hunting small game was part of everyday life. Selling squirrel stew was not just legal, it was expected. Local hunters would donate their catch, and volunteers would cook it up in massive pots. People lined up for a taste, often paying to support a local charity or school group. Nobody asked where the meat came from or whether it had been inspected. If it smelled good and tasted right, that was good enough. Today, squirrel stew is nearly impossible to sell legally at public events. The reason? Modern food origin traceability laws. Any meat served to the public must come from an approved source, be processed in a certified facility, and have full documentation for traceability. Caught game like squirrel does not meet any of those criteria. What was once a community favorite is now considered a food safety risk. Even if the stew is perfectly cooked, the origin of the meat alone makes it a liability. You can still make squirrel stew at home, and some rural restaurants may serve it legally under certain conditions. But as far as fairs and festivals go, it is a thing of the past, and it is not coming back anytime soon. Long before there were tea bags or coffee shops on every corner, people made their own herbal teas at home. One of the most popular varieties was sassafras tea, brewed from the roots and bark of the sassafras tree. It had a naturally sweet, slightly spicy flavor and was often served warm during cold months. Some folks even believed it had medicinal properties, like cleansing the blood or treating colds. The key ingredient was sassafras oil, rich in a compound called safrole. And that is where the problem started. In the 1960s, scientists discovered that safrole could cause liver damage and cancer in laboratory animals. As a result, the Food and Drug Administration banned sassafras oil as a food additive. What was once considered a wholesome, homegrown remedy became a health hazard overnight. Today, real sassafras oil is banned from commercial food and drink products in the United States. You can still find sassafras-flavored teas, but they use a safrole-free extract or artificial flavoring. The real stuff? Off the market. You can technically still harvest and brew it yourself in small amounts. But selling it is another story. Homemade sassafras tea with real oil is illegal to sell and flagged as a carcinogen risk. It is a powerful reminder of how something can go from folk medicine to federal offense. Sassafras tea was once a symbol of rural tradition. Now it is a banned substance in your cup. In the mid-20th century, gelatin molds were the crown jewel of dinner parties and bridge club gatherings. These shimmering creations were filled with everything from fruit and cottage cheese to vegetables and, yes, raw seafood. Shrimp, oysters, and even thin slices of raw fish were suspended in lime or lemon gelatin and proudly displayed as the centerpiece of a well-set table. The idea was part convenience, part culinary daring. Housewives followed recipes from popular magazines and community cookbooks. If you could suspend it in gelatin, you could serve it. Raw seafood added a touch of luxury, even if the texture left some guests raising their eyebrows. Today, that same dish would violate food safety laws in most states. Serving raw seafood, especially in commercial settings, requires strict temperature control, specific sourcing, and often a special license. And gelatin? It does not offer any protection against harmful bacteria or parasites. The Food and Drug Administration now requires any raw seafood intended for consumption to meet detailed standards. That includes freezing at specific temperatures to kill parasites and ensuring it comes from approved suppliers. A home cook making shrimp jello for friends? Probably safe. A business trying to sell it at a market or cafe? Not happening. What used to be a showstopper at social events is now banned from most commercial kitchens. The gelatin mold with raw fish is no longer a conversation piece. It is a health code violation waiting to happen. In certain coastal communities, particularly in the mid-20th century, School lunches occasionally featured something that would be shocking today: whale or even dolphin meat. These were not urban legends. In some fishing towns, especially near ports or whaling industries, schools substituted beef or pork with what was readily available: marine mammals. It was not widespread, but it did happen. Whale meat was seen as practical, protein-rich, and economical. It was often smoked, canned, or ground into patties and served with gravy or mashed potatoes. In some cases, schools received surplus from nearby processing facilities. It was local, legal, and no one thought much of it. Today, the idea of feeding whale or dolphin meat to children in public schools is not just controversial, it is illegal. The Marine Mammal Protection Act and international agreements now prohibit the hunting and commercial distribution of most marine mammals. These species are protected by law, and their use in any food program would lead to serious legal consequences. Beyond legality, the cultural shift has been massive. Dolphins and whales are now seen as intelligent, sentient creatures. They are not food. They are icons of conservation and marine biology. It is one of the clearest examples of how what was once considered practical and unremarkable is now completely unthinkable. From lunch tray to federal offense, the transformation is total. Feeding children whale meat today would not just raise eyebrows, it would launch an international scandal. For generations, lard was not just a cooking fat, it was the cooking fat. Rendered pork fat, made at home from trimmings or scraps, was used in nearly every recipe. Fried chicken, lard, pie crust, lard biscuits, also lard. And nothing was more iconic than Grandma's cast iron skillet, passed down through generations and seasoned with a century's worth of meals. The lard itself was homemade. After butchering a pig, families would boil the fat down, strain it, and pour it into jars or tins to keep in the pantry. No refrigeration, no expiration dates, just instinct, smell, and tradition. But while home-rendered lard is still legal for personal use, it is now strictly prohibited in commercial settings unless it comes from an inspected, approved source. That is because home-rendered animal fats are not regulated, and using them in food sold to the public violates modern health codes. Even small restaurants or bakeries that want to use traditional methods must use certified lard from approved suppliers. No more scooping a dollop from a tin in the back room. It is a bittersweet shift. On one hand, food safety standards have improved dramatically. On the other, something truly flavorful and nostalgic has been pushed into the shadows. What was once everyday comfort food is now a compliance issue. Grandma's skillet still has a place in the kitchen, but her lard? That is a health inspector's nightmare if it ends up in anything you are selling. There was a time when no one thought twice about the chemicals used in food packaging. One of the most alarming? Carbon tetrachloride, a chemical compound used in degreasing, fire extinguishers, and yes, even in food processing and packaging. It sounds unbelievable today, but carbon tetrachloride was once part of the machinery that made food look fresher, last longer, and feel cleaner. It was used to clean equipment, sterilize containers, and sometimes as part of the packaging itself. Its presence in trace amounts in processed foods was not questioned. It was standard. Then came science. By the 1970s, studies showed that carbon tetrachloride was a toxic compound linked to liver damage, kidney failure, and even cancer. It did not just clean surfaces, it lingered, and it was dangerous. The Food and Drug Administration, alongside the Environmental Protection Agency, moved to ban its use in anything food-related. Today, carbon tetrachloride is classified as a hazardous substance. It is illegal in food production and strictly regulated in industrial use. Any trace of it in food packaging would trigger a massive recall and likely legal action. It is a chilling reminder of how far we have come in understanding chemical safety. What was once invisible is now unacceptable. That shiny, clean package on your old box of crackers might have looked innocent. But behind the gloss? A chemical with a dark history that we now know has no place anywhere near our food. In tight-knit communities across America, it was once common for neighbors to buy things directly from each other: produce, preserves, and yes, even wild mushrooms. You would stop by the widow's garden down the street, drop a few coins into a coffee tin, and walk away with a paper bag full of mushrooms she picked that morning from her yard. There was no license, no inspection, no mushroom identification course, just trust, and maybe a little folklore. Some of those mushrooms were perfectly safe and even delicious, others not so much. The problem is that wild mushrooms are notoriously tricky to identify. One wrong pick can lead to severe illness or even death. Back then, this risk was largely unspoken or chalked up to bad luck. Today, that kind of sale is strictly prohibited under most local and state health codes. Selling wild foraged mushrooms requires special certification. You must prove you can correctly identify edible species, follow rules about harvesting, and label everything according to regulation. And even then, some states do not allow it at all unless the mushrooms are cultivated. It is a cautionary tale rooted in community trust, but corrected by modern science. What was once seen as quaint and neighborly is now considered reckless. That brown bag of mushrooms from the lady down the street. In today's world, it is not just illegal, it is potentially lethal, and no health department is going to look the other way. Before the Food and Drug Administration gained its modern authority, grocery store shelves were lined with canned meats of questionable origin. You could pick up a tin of lunch loaf, meat spread, or simply potted meat with no clear idea of what was inside. These mystery meats were cheap, shelf-stable, and widely consumed, especially during war and depression years when food security mattered more than clarity. Then came a series of food safety reforms in the mid-20th century. The Food and Drug Administration and the United States Department of Agriculture began requiring clear labeling, ingredient lists, and standardized processing rules. No more vague tins of mystery. If it went on a shelf, the consumer had a right to know what was in it. Today, selling an unlabeled meat product would be grounds for immediate recall and penalties. Even processed meats like Spam are required to disclose every component, down to preservatives and water content. We may still joke about mystery meat, especially in school cafeterias, but the real mystery meat, the stuff with no label and no rules, is a thing of the past. It is one of the best examples of regulation in action. Clarity replaced confusion. Safety replaced suspicion. And the consumer finally got to read what they were eating. Once a delicacy in old-school kitchens, rooster comb soup was made using the fleshy red crown from a rooster's head. It was simmered into a gelatin-rich broth thought to help with skin, joints, and even fertility. Nothing went to waste. Feet, neck, organs, and yes, the comb all went into the pot. Today, that same soup would be illegal to sell or serve. Rooster combs are uninspected animal parts, which means they cannot be processed or distributed for human consumption under United States Department of Agriculture rules. Risks include contamination and foodborne illness. What used to be clever and resourceful is now considered unsafe and unapproved. If someone served you rooster comb soup today, they would be violating food safety laws. It was a humble dish in hard times, but under modern regulation, it is officially off the table, and probably for the best. Before soda companies took over, families brewed birch beer right in their yards. Made with birch bark or sap, sugar, and yeast, it was spicy, earthy, and either lightly fizzy or slightly alcoholic, depending on how long it fermented. People loved it, but it was completely unregulated. Old recipes often included unsafe additives or reused barrels that leached chemicals into the drink. Some versions had way more alcohol than anyone expected. Today, that kind of home brewing is illegal for public sale. Making and selling any beverage with fermentation or medicinal ingredients requires permits, inspection, and lab testing. And banned substances? Forget it. While birch beer still exists, the homemade versions are history. Backyard barrels have been replaced by stainless steel and safety guidelines. What was once a folksy tradition is now a legal hazard. The kind of drink that could get you shut down before you take a sip. Turtle soup was once a rural staple, made with snapping turtles pulled from nearby ponds. It was thick, hearty, and made from whatever could be caught, cleaned, and cooked. No inspection, no paperwork, just tradition. Today, that dish would be practically impossible to serve legally. Many turtle species are now protected by law, and harvesting them from the wild is either banned or heavily restricted. On top of that, turtle meat carries health risks like salmonella and heavy metals. Modern food safety regulations require all meat to be inspected, sourced from certified farms, and processed under strict conditions. That old backyard turtle stew? Totally off limits. Once a symbol of resourcefulness and survival, turtle soup has become a relic of the past, replaced by concern for the environment and public health. In today's kitchens, it is not just uncommon, it is flat-out illegal. Homemade sausages once hung on porches like decorations, drying in the wind, seasoned with salt and smoke. Families used pork scraps, homemade casings, and curing knowledge passed down through generations. But there were no thermometers, no refrigeration, and no regulation. If you knew what you were doing, it was delicious. If not, it could be dangerous. Today, drying meat outdoors like that would be illegal. Sausages must be made in certified facilities, cured at exact temperatures, and tested for bacteria. The risks, including botulism, are too high to ignore. You can still find artisanal sausages, but they are produced under tight scrutiny. No health inspector will sign off on meat swaying in the breeze. Once a symbol of thrift and flavor, porch-cured sausage is now banned under food safety laws. What used to say, home cooking, now sounds like a call to the health department. Decades ago, pickled pig's feet sat in jars on store counters, vinegary, jiggly, and homemade. Packed in reused mason jars, they were handed out, sold, or gifted without labels or expiration dates. It was normal, and now, totally illegal. Modern food safety laws ban the sale of home-canned meat products unless processed in a licensed, inspected facility. Reused jars risk contamination, and improperly sealed meat can grow dangerous bacteria like botulism. Today, anything pickled and sold must be pH tested, pressure cooked, and packaged in sterilized, single-use containers. There is no room for guesswork. What used to be a neighborhood snack is now a liability. No matter how tasty or nostalgic, selling that jar of pig's feet could land someone in legal trouble. It was part of a make-do era, resourceful and bold. But by today's standards, it is a big red flag in a glass jar. Once a farmhouse staple, this cheese was made the old-fashioned way, with raw milk and natural animal rennet, usually from a calf's stomach. It was unpasteurized, full of flavor, and often sold locally or traded with neighbors. No packaging, no inspection, just strong smells, and even stronger traditions. Today, cheese like this is illegal to sell in most states unless it meets very specific criteria. Raw milk laws vary, but most require pasteurization to prevent foodborne illness. And the use of animal rennet? It must come from inspected sources. Unpasteurized cheese can carry dangerous bacteria like Listeria, especially when aged improperly or handled in home kitchens. That is why modern cheese production is tightly regulated. So that bold, tangy slice of local cheddar from decades ago? It is mostly gone, replaced by pasteurized, approved, and certified products. The flavor might have been unforgettable, but the health risks made it history. Unpasteurized apple cider was once a fall tradition. Families pressed apples by hand, poured the juice into big glass jugs, and let it bubble quietly in the basement. Sometimes it stayed sweet. Sometimes it turned hard. Either way, it got passed around the neighborhood, tangy, cloudy, and entirely homemade. No labels, no inspections, no real control. Today, unpasteurized cider is illegal to sell without meeting strict federal and state requirements. Because it is not heat-treated, it can carry dangerous pathogens like E. coli and salmonella. That basement batch from the 1940s, it would never pass a modern health inspection. Now, all cider for sale must be pasteurized or clearly labeled with health warnings. Fermenting it at home is fine for personal use, but the moment you sell or share it, regulation steps in. What once felt like fall in a bottle is now a legal risk wrapped in nostalgia. Not long ago, kids or local fishermen would catch river fish and go door to door selling it. It was fresh, sometimes, and usually sold out of a bucket with zero packaging, permits, or inspection. Neighbors trusted the source, not the science. Today, that same practice is completely illegal. Modern food safety laws require fish for sale to come from certified sources. They must be cleaned, handled, and transported under specific conditions. Wild-caught fish sold to the public must pass inspection to ensure it is safe to eat. Why? Because fish from local rivers can carry parasites, heavy metals, and harmful bacteria. Without regulation, it is impossible to guarantee safety. Selling uninspected fish today would violate both health codes and commercial licensing laws. What was once a side hustle for extra cash is now a fast track to fines. Those door-to-door fish deliveries? Gone, for good reason. One more thing that is thankfully gone are cow udders. Yes, you heard that right. Cow udders were once sliced, cooked, and served on sandwiches in diners and lunch counters, especially in rural or immigrant communities. They were usually boiled, breaded, and fried. It was a cheap source of protein, and no part of the animal was wasted. But today, you would be hard-pressed to find a legal way to serve cow udder. Under current food safety laws, udders fall under the category of organ meats that are not approved for human consumption unless inspected and processed under strict guidelines. That sandwich might have been thrifty once, but it is a serious red flag now. Cow udder sandwiches are no longer just unusual, they are banned and nearly forgotten. Once considered a delicacy in coastal and southern regions, raw turtle eggs were eaten soft, like oysters, or cooked into traditional dishes. Locals collected them by hand from nesting areas, sometimes roasting them over fire or slurping them raw. Today, that practice is both illegal and environmentally destructive. Turtle populations around the world are under threat, and collecting their eggs, especially from endangered species, is banned by both federal and international law. Consuming raw turtle eggs also poses health risks, including salmonella and other parasites. Wildlife protection agencies now monitor nesting areas to prevent egg harvesting. Offenders face heavy fines and even jail time. What was once seen as a rare treat is now recognized as a serious threat to biodiversity. Raw turtle eggs have gone from regional tradition to protected resource. In the eyes of the law, eating one today is not just outdated, it is criminal. Some dishes from the 1980s leave behind nostalgia. Others leave behind confusion. And nestled somewhere in between was marshmallow and bologna salad, a recipe that somehow managed to make its way into community cookbooks and potluck tables across the Midwest. Often served chilled in molded shapes or as a salad in name only, it typically featured chopped bologna, mini marshmallows, mayonnaise or Miracle Whip, and sometimes crushed pineapple or pickles, depending on the household's loyalty to sweet or savory. It was the edible equivalent of a coin toss, either oddly appealing or instantly regrettable. This peculiar pairing didn't appear by accident. Processed meats and shelf-stable ingredients were central to 1980s meal planning, especially in households relying on food assistance or bulk discounts. Bologna was cheap and versatile. Marshmallows added a sugar hit in a decade that loved its sweetness. More importantly, it was a no-cook, quick assembly option when time, money, and refrigeration were all in short supply. What ultimately doomed the dish wasn't just shifting tastes, it was science. Bologna's high nitrate content, when combined with other processed foods, drew increasing scrutiny. So, you're all familiar with the way Coca-Cola used to have cocaine, right? Well, in the 1950s, that stopped being a thing, at least on paper. It did, however, still have the coca leaf extract. The very earliest Coca-Cola recipes from the 1880s had small amounts of cocaine from coca leaves, and back then it was pretty common. By 1904, though, amidst growing substance abuse concerns, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was passed, making cocaine officially illegal. By the 50s, the drink was stimulant-free, but cocaine comes from those leaves and the extract they're still using, so what gives? Well, this was a little technical and legal loophole. The Stepan Company was one company that operated during this time and had a nice arrangement with the United States government. It was given the right to import coca leaves, albeit under government supervision, and only as long as all traces of cocaine were extracted. These drained leaves would then be used as a flavoring. This agreement and this company still stand today, and the agreement was even reinforced in 1986. Plus, they had to spend an incredible amount of effort and time rebranding Coca-Cola's image. By the 50s, people hadn't forgotten its powdery past, but they were starting to. That's how it's turned into the mainstream family drink you have in your refrigerator today. Holiday parties in the 1970s weren't complete without a giant bowl of homemade eggnog, rich, creamy, and laced with enough booze to keep the festivities going. It was made the old-fashioned way with fresh eggs, heavy cream, sugar, and a generous pour of rum, brandy, or whiskey. And once mixed, it often sat out for hours, left at room temperature for guests to ladle into their cups all evening long. Refrigeration? That was for leftovers. Eggnog had been made this way for centuries, with the belief that alcohol would kill off any harmful bacteria lurking in the raw eggs. And for the most part, people drank it without issue. Families swore by their own special recipes, passing them down like treasured heirlooms. The longer it sat, the better the flavors blended, or at least that was the logic. But as food safety research advanced, experts started warning that alcohol wasn't the magic disinfectant people thought it was. Raw eggs carried the risk of salmonella, and dairy left out too long could turn an indulgent holiday treat into a fast track to food poisoning. By the late 20th century, pasteurized eggs became the safer choice, and most modern eggnog recipes required refrigeration. Curious minds might raise an eyebrow at the idea that, during the 1960s, individuals resorted to an unlikely source of nourishment: canned dog food. A few families saw it as a last resort in times of hardship. Far from modern-day grocery aisles brimming with processed dinners, resources could be so thin that this canine cuisine found its way onto human plates. Officials often overlooked the contents, leaving potential bacterial hazards unchecked, which wasn't a five-star guarantee of safety. Surprisingly, there was minimal pushback from authorities regarding its distribution. Without modern health inspections, contamination occasionally slipped by, raising concerns about sanitation and disease. Despite these risks, the product's easy availability attracted desperate shoppers, who discovered it was cheaper than most meat options. That affordability turned it into a peculiar standby, although tastiness was sometimes questionable at best. Regulations were not particularly strict back then, so certain labels didn't specify the exact ingredients lurking within each can. Reflecting on that era reveals a culture willing to stretch a dollar when the cupboard ran bare. Desserts in the 1980s weren't just sweet, they were engineered for speed, shelf life, and maximum effect with minimal effort. Instant coffee whipped cream pie checked all three boxes. A no-bake dessert made by folding instant coffee granules into whipped topping, often Cool Whip, then spooning the airy mixture into a graham cracker crust. This pie offered a caffeine kick with the illusion of elegance. Some recipes added gelatin for structure. Others used condensed milk or chocolate syrup, but all shared one thing: simplicity powered by pantry staples. The rise of this pie coincided with America's love affair with instant everything. From powdered soups to pudding mixes, convenience foods dominated home cooking. Coffee-flavored desserts had a grown-up appeal without requiring espresso machines or stovetop brewing, something many kitchens didn't yet have. For home cooks juggling work, kids, and potlucks, it was a way to bring something fancy without turning on the oven. Over time, the cracks began to show, literally and figuratively. Hydrogenated oils in whipped toppings, high fructose corn syrup, and artificial coffee flavorings drew increasing scrutiny. Have you ever felt so hungry you thought you could take down a whole horse? Well, in the 1950s, that wasn't just a piece of hyperbole, it was a very literal statement. While horse meat never really rose to the heights a tenderloin steak or blue crabs did, it was something that people warmed up to more and more as economic strife and being a U.S. citizen started going hand in hand. Do you remember how we were just talking about trans fats being rooted in World War II-era food rationing strategies? Yeah, that whole period really induced a new way of thinking when it came to food. People were doubling down on making the most of whatever they had and opening their horizons to things they had previously been really dismissive of. Horse meat had a pretty bad reputation. especially since most Americans had a sentimental view of horses. They were pets. They were your next best friend after dogs, they were great workers, and they were beautiful animals you could write poetry about. I think we romanticize anything we can ride into the sunset. But anyway, horse meat started to become a pretty common alternative to beef. Butcher shops would even change the name to have an easier time selling it. But most people started to pick up on the fact that cheval wasn't really real meat. Plus, as technology developed and replaced traditional agricultural methods, a lot of farmers found that they had no real use for all the horses they had anymore. And, well, I know I said they were your second closest bestie, but you'd be surprised what people will do to have fewer mouths to feed, especially if it feeds their own in the process. A crisp autumn day in the 1970s wasn't complete without a trip to the local farm stand. Fresh apples, homemade pies, and of course, a jug of unpasteurized apple cider, cloudy, rich, and straight from the press. It was a seasonal tradition, the kind of drink you poured into a glass and sipped cold, or warmed up on the stove with a cinnamon stick. No labels, no expiration dates, just fresh-pressed fruit in its purest form. For generations, farm-fresh juices were a staple, especially in rural areas where people trusted their local orchards. The juice was made by simply crushing fruit and collecting the liquid. No heat treatment, no extra processing, and because it wasn't filtered, it had that distinct, pulpy texture that store-bought juice just couldn't match. But as food safety research advanced, so did concerns over harmful bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella. Unpasteurized juice, while natural, carried risks, especially for children and the elderly. By the 1990s, regulations tightened, requiring warning labels and, in many cases, pasteurization for commercial sale. While you can still find raw cider at some farm stands, it often comes with a disclaimer. Of all the risky delicacies in food history, few come with stakes as high as canned puffer fish. Revered for its delicate taste, yet feared for its lethal potential, this fish contains tetrodotoxin, a neurotoxin so potent that a dose smaller than a pinhead can cause paralysis and death. Today, only highly trained chefs are allowed to prepare it, but in the past, access was far less controlled. In unregulated markets, improperly prepared fugu was available in cans, turning a simple meal into a gamble with survival. The appeal of fugu wasn't just about flavor, it was about thrill. For some, eating it was a status symbol, a culinary daredevil act that proved one's bravery. But unlike most food-related risks, this one didn't end with an upset stomach. There's no antidote for tetrodotoxin, meaning a mistake in preparation could be fatal. Yet, regulations in the 1960s weren't nearly as strict as they are today, and canned versions were sold in some markets without the careful oversight now required. As reports of poisoning surfaced, authorities clamped down. Many countries banned unregulated sales, limiting its preparation to certified chefs. Teen parties in the 1970s were a little different from today. There were no viral videos, no social media evidence, just loud music, questionable fashion choices, and in some cases, a tray of brightly colored gelatin shots hidden in the fridge. These boozy little treats, made by mixing flavored gelatin with hard liquor, were a sneaky way for underage drinkers to bypass the telltale scent of alcohol. If a parent walked by, they just looked like an innocent dessert. The concept was simple. Boil water, stir in a packet of gelatin, and instead of cold water, add vodka, rum, or whatever was on hand. Pour it into small cups, let it set, and within a few hours, the party had a new centerpiece. The appeal? They were easy to make, easy to eat, and for inexperienced drinkers, easy to underestimate. While underage drinking was nothing new, the rise of gelatin shots added an extra layer of risk. The alcohol wasn't diluted in a cocktail. It was concentrated in a sweet, jiggly form that went down too easily. By the 1980s, stricter laws on underage drinking and alcohol enforcement made these party staples less common. A staple in military mess halls long before it landed on suburban breakfast tables, this dish earned an unforgettable nickname among soldiers, though we'll stick with the polite version, chipped beef on toast. In the 1980s, it was still commonly served in homes, diners, and school cafeterias, especially in regions with strong military ties. Made by simmering thin slices of dried beef in a thick, creamy white gravy and pouring it over toasted bread, the dish was quick, filling, and economical, an all-in-one solution for hungry families on a budget. Its origins date back to World War II, when shelf-stable dried beef was prized for its long storage life and portability. By the time it hit mainstream kitchens, it was marketed in jars and vacuum-sealed pouches, making it even easier to prepare with just a few pantry items. The gravy, typically made with butter, flour, and whole milk, added richness, but also brought a heavy dose of fat and salt. Eventually, the nutritional profile caught up with its popularity. Processed dried beef contained high amounts of sodium, nitrates, and preservatives that later raised red flags with health agencies. Increased scrutiny over salt content and the risks of regular consumption led to its quiet phase-out. Ketchup's near and dear to everyone's hearts, but most of us are used to it being red on its own. In the 50s, though, people actually bought artificially colored ketchup. This was completely red, almost obsessively so. In hindsight, it wasn't that odd for food colorings and synthetic dyes to be used, but towards the 50s, and particularly the end of the 50s, started using all kinds of strong dyes. There was an almost strange obsession with getting the perfect cherry red aesthetic for each ketchup company. All of them were doing this: Hunt's, Del Monte's, and even Heinz. They started to have it in just about every ketchup product they released. This one never really became illegal. It's still something they do to this day. But there definitely was a lot of demand for natural ketchup lately. I kind of get it. It's just a dip made out of tomatoes, so why bother making it extra red? These next few items are really going to take you for a spin. I mean, we've had horses and turtles so far, but these really come into the top 3. Lard was a really dominant fat, as you might already know. It's basically half the flavor in all of our fast food chains, and there are many hamburgers that wouldn't have their reputation without it. There are an equal number of people going to their doctor for cardiac issues at an alarmingly young age due to it as well. But why was pig fat rendered everyone's drug of choice? Well, in fast food frying, it was known for doing a few delicious things. It gave the food a crispy texture like nothing else did. It enhanced the flavor way better than any natural oils ever did. And since pork was already so widely produced and consumed just about, well, everywhere, it was also a lot more available and affordable than, let's say, unprocessed vegetable oils. This meant that it was ideal for the fast food industry, which almost always needed large-scale frying. Nowadays, there are places that still make lard-based fast food like in the old times, but most people were very happy trading away the flavor for the extra health gains. I guess if you really wanted an authentic one, you'd have to find somebody that tried them in the 50s because they used to use proper beef tallow back then, straight from the animal. It's still something you see a lot in little corners here and there, like Mexican-American cuisine or soul food, but as far as the mainstream goes, it's a relic of the past. In the 1970s, grabbing a cold soda meant reaching for a thick glass bottle with bold, colorful branding baked right onto the surface. Those logos and labels weren't just stickers. They were printed directly onto the glass using bright, long-lasting enamel paints. The problem was, many of those paints contained lead, and every sip from the bottle meant a potential exposure to toxic heavy metals. Lead-based paints had been used for decades because they were durable, resisted fading, and made the logos pop. No one thought twice about it. You'd twist off the cap, take a swig, and maybe even collect the empty bottles for a few cents at the local store. Kids played with them, stacked them up, or even used them for makeshift science experiments. But the real science was happening in labs, where researchers began linking lead exposure to serious health risks, especially for children. By the late 20th century, regulations started phasing out lead in household products, including paint, gasoline, and eventually soda bottles. By the early 1990s, U.S. manufacturers had moved to safer alternatives. Today, soda branding is mostly done with paper or plastic labels, but for those who remember the old glass bottles, they were a piece of pop culture, with a little extra toxicity on the side. Movie nights in the 1980s weren't complete without a bowl or a bucket of popcorn so saturated with butter-flavored topping it left fingerprints on the VHS remote. Known informally in theaters and homes alike as butter-drowned popcorn, it wasn't just a snack. It was a ritual. Whether poured from a pump at the concession stand or doused at home from a stovetop saucepan, the more golden and glistening, the better. And while the flavor was unmistakably rich, that buttery coating wasn't exactly butter. The topping used in theaters and many pre-packaged microwave versions was often made from partially hydrogenated oils mixed with artificial butter flavoring and food dyes. It gave the illusion of indulgence without the cost or perishability of real dairy. At home, popcorn popped in oil and drowned in margarine or similar substitutes offered the same effect, economical and crowd-pleasing. But the buttery bliss came at a price. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, researchers began sounding alarms about trans fats found in hydrogenated oils. Meanwhile, the artificial flavoring diacetyl, used in many commercial butter flavorings, was linked to respiratory illness in factory workers exposed to it in concentrated amounts. So we aren't done with the list of harmful substances that used to be in our food just yet. Next, we have canned fish with mercury in it. And yes, it was lethal. While different times in the 50s and different companies each had their own ideas of what the ideal amount of mercury was, most people were definitely in on the secret. So the thing about mercury is that it's actually very present in the environment, but that's always been in very manageable amounts. It wasn't until there was such a sharp increase in coal burning and chemical manufacturing that mercury levels shot through the roof throughout the country. It also led to a higher amount of a particularly dangerous kind of mercury, which was methylmercury. Not just the cans. People were starting to get really concerned about the amount of mercury in their fish, too. Plus, testing was really limited, and there were very strict regulations on mercury content. It wasn't until the 1970s that this would change, and a cap of 1 parts per million was set on canned tuna. This was a start, but think of all the damage it already did. How many times did your grandpa potentially eat mercury-laced mackerel or tuna? In the 1970s, lighting up a cigarette at the dinner table wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Restaurants had ashtrays on every table, waiters took orders through a haze of smoke, and no one batted an eye if you alternated bites of steak with puffs of a Marlboro. Whether at home, in a diner, or even on an airplane, smoking while eating was just part of the culture. Back then, cigarette ads featured doctors, Hollywood icons, and even cartoon camels, reinforcing the idea that smoking wasn't just normal, it was sophisticated. Families would gather around the table, and after a home-cooked meal, someone would light up without a second thought. At fast food joints, parents puffed away while kids unwrapped cheeseburgers. Even in fancy restaurants, a good meal was often finished with a cigarette and a cup of coffee, like some kind of ritual. But as medical studies piled up linking secondhand smoke to serious health risks, the public's tolerance started to shift. The first major bans started in the late 80s, and by the 2000s, smoking in restaurants was virtually extinct. Funnily enough, beluga caviar used to be pretty cheap. I mean, by the 50s, it was definitely a plaything of the uber elite, but it started out as a pretty cheap thing you could just get from sturgeon. It's kind of hard to imagine, right? The image we associate with it today started from upper-class culture, basically putting the thing on a pedestal. It didn't help that every establishment that was meant to cater to this exclusive class was also putting it on all of their menus. You had beluga caviar on crackers with expensive champagne or chilled vodka, with blini and creme fraiche. The possibilities were pretty endless. It became something you associate with old money, with diplomatic gatherings and big political events, and the kind of thing that was just too rich for the blood of an average worker. That's still true today, but hey, it's at least comforting to know that in some era, it used to be considered pretty cheap, almost unsavory, really. Do you get the hype? I mean, let's say you had the money to burn. Would you still be spending it on caviar? Not to impress a date or to hit a rich flex, just as a food. By the mid-20th century, the pursuit of guilt-free sweetness was in full swing. Sugar alternatives promised all the flavor with none of the calories, and few artificial sweeteners were as widely embraced as saccharin. First discovered in the late 1800s, it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that it became a staple in diet sodas, processed foods, and even table sweeteners. With no clear regulations on its long-term effects, it was marketed as the perfect solution for those looking to cut sugar without sacrificing taste. But what seemed like a miracle ingredient soon came under scrutiny. Early animal studies linked saccharin to bladder cancer in lab rats, triggering widespread concern. While the findings weren't immediately confirmed in humans, the idea of a potentially carcinogenic sweetener sitting in coffee cups across the country was enough to prompt action. By the late 1970s, the FDA required warning labels on products containing saccharin, and in some places, bans followed. Further research eventually led to a reversal of some of those restrictions, but the damage to saccharin's reputation was done. Today, it's still used in limited capacities, though consumers have largely moved on to other artificial sweeteners. By the mid-20th century, the pursuit of guilt-free sweetness was in full swing. Sugar alternatives promised all the flavor with none of the calories, and few artificial sweeteners were as widely embraced as saccharin. First discovered in the late 1800s, it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that it became a staple in diet sodas, processed foods, and even table sweeteners. With no clear regulations on its long-term effects, it was marketed as the perfect solution for those looking to cut sugar without sacrificing taste. But what seemed like a miracle ingredient soon came under scrutiny. Early animal studies linked saccharin to bladder cancer in lab rats, triggering widespread concern. While the findings weren't immediately confirmed in humans, the idea of a potentially carcinogenic sweetener sitting in coffee cups across the country was enough to prompt action. By the late 1970s, the FDA required warning labels on products containing saccharin, and in some places, bans followed. Further research eventually led to a reversal of some of those restrictions, but the damage to saccharin's reputation was done. Today, it's still used in limited capacities, though consumers have largely moved on to other artificial sweeteners. So, what if I told you people actually ate monkey brains in the 50s back then? I think given the state of the rest of this list, you would probably be inclined to believe me too. But don't worry, dear viewer. I'm not going to traumatize you with elaborate descriptions of monkey minds. This was mostly just an unverified folk myth that got really popular for a few reasons. Generational discontent with the uber-wealthy, popular myths about Chinese cuisines, and a lot of over-the-top elaborate fictional propaganda by Hollywood films. I don't mean actual propaganda, but some films might have spread the idea that monkey brains were actually consumed, when that couldn't be further from the truth. The Temple of Doom and the original Indiana Jones were still really good movies, though. Don't let odd scenes with monkey brains for dessert turn you off from that. If we actually look at the facts, though, no one can really find any historical evidence for monkey brains being a solidified culinary moment in American cuisine. There would at least be super niche references to a dish if it was underground, a part of a specific culture or some kind of phenomena only in specific culinary circles, but nope, nothing comes up for monkey brains. And I thank God for that. Back in the 1970s, hot dogs were everywhere, at ballparks, backyard cookouts, and school cafeterias. Whether boiled, grilled, or roasted over an open flame, they were an American staple. What few people realized, though, was that those perfectly pink Franks owed their color and long shelf life to a heavy dose of sodium nitrates. These preservatives kept hot dogs looking fresh and safe from bacterial growth, but over time, concerns started sizzling. Nitrates and nitrites were widely used in processed meats, not just for preservation, but also to enhance flavor. The problem? Studies began linking high nitrate consumption to potential cancer risks, particularly due to their conversion into nitrosamines, compounds found to be carcinogenic in lab tests. While no one was dropping their hot dog at the site of a study, health experts started warning against excessive consumption, especially for kids who were already eating them by the dozen. By the late 20th century, regulations tightened, and manufacturers began reducing nitrate levels while introducing uncured options with natural preservatives like celery powder. Today, nitrate-free hot dogs are an alternative, but traditional versions still exist, just with stricter oversight. In the 1960s, packaging was more about durability and design than long-term safety, and nowhere was that more evident than in lead-based paint on food containers. Vibrant labels, eye-catching colors, and a sturdy finish made these containers look appealing on store shelves. But hidden beneath the surface was a toxic hazard. Lead-based paint, commonly used in everything from household walls to children's toys, also found its way onto food packaging, a decision that, in hindsight, was as dangerous as it sounds. At the time, lead's risks weren't fully understood by the general public. While scientists had long suspected its dangers, regulations were slow to catch up. The problem was that lead doesn't just stay on the surface. Over time, it can leach into food, especially acidic products like canned tomatoes. Consumers had no way of knowing that their favorite pantry staples might come with a side of neurotoxicity. The health risks were severe. Chronic exposure to lead can cause developmental issues in children, memory problems in adults, and even organ failure in extreme cases. As research mounted, the government stepped in. By the late 1970s, lead-based paints were banned from food-related products. Which of these illegal foods would you indulge in? Comment below and don't forget to like and subscribe.